earlier today, this afternoon, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech, and this is why I say that it's so clear that they are deliberately attempting to resurrect the framework of 9/11. The framework imposed by George Bush and Dick Cheney and by the neocons in that administration, not just about the right way to respond to what are called terrorist attacks, but the discourse surrounding how we think about that as well. First of all, just before I even comment on this at all, let's listen to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said earlier today in Jerusalem.
Hamas are the new Nazis. Hamas is ISIS, in some instances worse than ISIS. And just as the world united to defeat the Nazis, just as the world united to defeat ISIS, the world has to stand united behind Israel to defeat Hamas. This is part of an axis of evil of Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas.
So note there, I mean, first of all, we're again at the stage. We were just at the stage 6 months ago where people were actually saying that Vladimir Putin is not just the new Hitler, he's actually worse than Hitler. You had people, obsessive fanatics, when it comes to Russia, like Michael McFaul, the former ambassador under President Obama to Russia for the United States, who went on MSNBC and basically said, whatever you think about Hitler, there are certain things he wouldn't do that Putin is now doing to try and say Putin is worse than Hitler. Worse than ISIS? Remember, we had Al-Qaeda that we were told had no limits, was the worst thing ever to appear. We were told then they were as bad as the Nazis, if not worse. And then when it was time for a new group to emerge, it had to be scarier than Al-Qaeda in order for it to work, so we were given ISIS. The most savage, it didn't get more inhumane than ISIS. They were sadists, and they were. But now we're at the point where you have to go even further. So now we're being told that Israel's enemies are worse than ISIS. Basically as bad as Nazis, if not worse. So the entire world now must unite, not just against Israel's enemy in Gaza, but all of Israel's enemies. All of Israel's enemies are the world's enemies. And it is obviously not a coincidence that Benjamin Netanyahu decided to call this kind of tripartite union of Israel's enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, to describe them as the axis of evil. The axis of evil, of course, was the notorious phrase that was written by David Frum when he was the neocon speechwriter for George W. Bush in 2001 and 2002. That was the phrase that emerged in George W. Bush's State of the Union address in January of 2002, when he blamed the anthrax attacks on Iraq, preparing the nation to go to war with Iraq based on the multiple lies, but including the lie that the anthrax attacks had come from Saddam Hussein. And he also, because the neocons didn't want just a war against Iraq, they wanted a war against multiple countries, he called the axis of evil Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And it was like a cartoon phrase. It was a villain caricature of how children are taught to think about the good guys versus the bad guys in every cartoon film and children's film and cartoon and comic strips. And it was mocked incessantly at the time, but it became the kind of symbol of neocon deceit, this phrase, axis of evil, that Netanyahu, who's very well steeped in American history and American politics, especially obviously when it comes to 9/11. He was the Israeli prime minister in the 1990s. He's very well aware of what that phrase is and what it means, and it's designed to not just subconsciously, but quite explicitly essentially say, this is another 9/11 moment, and because it's another 9/11 moment, the world now must unite to fight Israel's enemies, just like the world united, or some of the world united, to fight the United States'. And so he's purposely using the insignia, the kind of ethos of 9/11, including adopting the very phrase that came to define it, and define the neocon attempt to essentially divide the world into good and evil. and just say you're either on the side of good, which was the United States and now is Israel, or you're on the side of evil, which means anyone who questions what those governments do. He used the phrase axis of evil on purpose. This is to them 9/11, and they want to reintroduce the mindset that dominated. A lot of people didn't live through 9/11. It's one of the things about getting older that you realize history becomes deader and deader every year to more and more people. And for people who did live through it, it was 22 years ago. It's a long time ago. And a lot of people can be oriented to recall the emotions associated with 9/11 without remembering those lessons. Let's listen to the rest.
Their goal, open goal, is to eradicate the state of Israel. The open goal of Hamas is to kill as many Jews as they could, and the only difference is they would have killed every last one of us, murdered every last one of us, if they could. They just don't have the capacity, but they murdered an extraordinary 1,300 civilians, which in American terms is like many, many, many 9/11s.
First of all, capacity, the question of capacity kind of matters. It matters. There are probably some people who were at the Capitol on January 6th who would have liked to have overthrown the U.S. government. They would have liked to. They don't have the capacity because they were not a military and they were confronting the most powerful and militarized government and the most paramilitarized government ever to exist in human history. So maybe in their imagination they would have liked to have overthrown the government. Not all of them. Some of them were just protesting what they perceived as fraud in the election, but some of them probably would have liked to. But the fact that they didn't have the capacity makes a gigantic difference in terms of how we respond. When Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were marching on Moscow with 25,000 armed, heavily armed soldiers, heavily trained soldiers, including people who had the capacity to shoot down jets from the sky, that was a much different threat than 1,000 or so largely overweight and highly inactive Trump supporters from Facebook. It matters a lot. The Israeli government is incredibly powerful. The Israeli military is the most powerful by far in that region. And so when you're thinking about comparing this to Nazi Germany, the government, the Nazis who had this incredibly industrialized military, the likes of which the world had never seen before, that came very close to conquering all of Europe. The fact that Hamas is just a kind of ragtag bunch of people who don't have they don't have an air force, they don't have a navy, they don't have an army. They're capable of doing some damage, but nowhere near enough to threaten the existence of Israel. That actually matters. That's not just a detail. And when we're thinking about how to respond, that matters a lot.
1,300 civilians, which in American terms is like many, many, many 9/11s.
Let me just say one thing about this too, this kind of math, this new math that's now being used. That because Israel has a smaller population than the United States, it means that when one Israeli dies, the impact of that loss of life is greater than when an American dies, because it's a smaller percentage of the population that America lost in 9/11 than the Israelis have lost from the Hamas attack, because it's a higher percentage of the population. First of all, the Gazans have an even lower population. So when you kill 2,000 of them based on this math, that's like 80 9/11s or 100 9/11s. That's not a valid way of looking at things. Every human life has equal value. And if you are going to apply this and say, well, this event in Israel was worse than 9/11, it was like 10 9/11s or 100 9/11s, then how many 9/11s has Gaza suffered over the last 10 years or the last week? And I say this not to be glib, but because one of the things that's happening is an attempt to insist there are no universally applicable principles. That the United States and Israel live by one set of rules and everybody else lives by another set, that American Israeli lives have greater value than the lives of people in Gaza or Somalia or Yemen. or Syria or Libya, where the United States brings violence, or where Israel does. I think this is becoming a pervasive way of thinking, and it seems kind of innocuous, but I think it's pretty pernicious.
So obviously we must take action to defeat Hamas and to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But this is not only our battle, it is our common battle, the battle of civilization against barbarism. And if it's not stopped here, this savagery will reach you very soon and reach the entire world.
Is Hamas a threat to the United States? If you're an American, do you feel threatened by Hamas, menaced by Hamas? Do you believe Hamas is going to come to the United States and bring violence to your shores the way it did to Israel? I don't think that's going to happen. And if it is going to happen, I think the way to make that threat worse for the United States is to involve itself and stand up and say, we are going to sponsor and fund and arm this attack on all of Israel's enemies, which apparently includes, under this axis of evil, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and Iran. That seems the way to endanger American national security, not refusing to join in Israel in everything that it wants to do. Now, speaking of an attempt to resurrect 9/11, we showed you this last week. Here's the official Instagram account of the Israeli Defense Forces. Here's what they posted on October 11th. You either stand with Israel or you stand with terrorism. You have two choices, and only two. Stand with Israel, applaud everything Israel does, support everything Israel does, applaud Israeli leaders. That's one option. Or be on the side of terrorists, stand with the terrorists. And again, that is not a coincidence. One of the things that David Frum also wrote that came out of George Bush's mouth was his notorious declaration on September 20th, 10 days after the 9/11 attack, September 20th, 2001, when he addressed a joint session of Congress. And George Bush said the world now has a choice. Either you stand with us or you stand with the terrorists. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Same thing. That was just like the axis of evil, this cartoonish attempt to tell the world they had a binary choice. You either applaud George Bush and Dick Cheney and the neocons, or you stand accused of being on Al-Qaeda's side. When I say that they're trying to revitalize and resurrect and reimpose the framework of 9/11, you don't need to rely on what I'm saying. You can just see it in the words they're choosing to use themselves. And if that wasn't enough, they actually dragged George Bush himself out from wherever it is that he hides and does his paintings. And he came forward to share his views, which he rarely does. This time he shared his views on the war in Israel. And it's like we all got time machined and jettisoned back to 2002, where conservatives, a lot of them at least, on Fox News and elsewhere, are partying like it's 2002. And they brought out George Bush himself, as if the point needed to be even made more explicitly, and this is what he said.
It's going to be chaotic, and it's going to be, look, it's a democracy, and in a democracy, the people's voices matter, and there's going to be a weariness. You watch, the world's going to be, okay, let's negotiate. You know, Israel's got to negotiate. They're not going to negotiate. These people have played their cards. They want to kill as many Israelis as they can, and negotiating with killers is not an option for the elected government of Israel. And so we're just going to have to remain steadfast, but it's not going to take long. That's gone on too long. Surely there's a way to settle this through negotiations. Both sides are guilty. My view is one side is guilty, and it's not Israel.
I mean, that is what George Bush was saying in September and October of 2001, and then January of 2002, and then August of 2002, and then February and March of 2003 as the world and the United States prepared to invade Iraq. So you kind of just like have all the greatest hits being played by the aging rock stars who are now being wheeled out to sing them. We have the axis of evil, and you're either with us or with the terrorists, and we have George Bush. Here we also have Condoleezza Rice, who was George Bush's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. She was the primary architect of the torture regime. They would have meetings in the White House where they would endorse specific interrogation techniques that, again, it's not controversial to call it torture. The United States itself had always prosecuted it as torture, had argued it was illegal. It wasn't just waterboarding, it was sleep deprivation and stress positions and using extreme heat and cold and threatening people with mock executions. Horrific kinds of abuse on helpless detainees that the United States had always argued was a war crime and a violation of the most basic humanitarianism. It was Condoleezza Rice who chaired those meetings where those methods were approved and choreographed. But she was also probably most known for her fear-mongering about what would happen if we didn't invade Iraq. She stood up in a speech, I believe it was in Ohio, in the fall of 2002, so less than 6 months before the United States invaded Iraq, when there was a debate about whether the United States government had provided the evidence that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. And she was scornful of the people questioning that. And she said, it seems like what you're waiting for is a smoking gun, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a nuclear cloud. Telling Americans, if you don't let us go and remove Saddam Hussein, he's going to take the nuclear weapons he has and pass them to the terrorists who are going to detonate it in the United States. That all turned out to be false. And it wasn't just that it was false, it led to one of the biggest disasters that the United States has ever engaged in. Not just a mistake, but a moral crime that ended the lives unnecessarily of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, if not above 1 million. And as I said earlier, according to Tony Blair, is what gave rise to ISIS and the instability in that region that we're still dealing with today. In a decent society, in a healthy society, people like Condoleezza Rice or George Bush would be afraid to show their face. The thing we're seeing now is that there is nothing more devastating to the human condition than unleashing the monsters of war. It triggers and facilitates and nurtures the most savage and barbaric parts of us, which we all have lurking near the surface, because we evolved for thousands of years with that savagery and barbarism as necessary for survival. And civilization is designed to suppress that, to keep it under wraps. And war necessarily unleashes it. The worst human impulses, which is why we're seeing this kind of rhetoric. People in Israel can go and find civilians and know they're civilians and just gun them down. Or countries being willing to admit that they're cutting off the access to food and drinking water for 2 million people or more. Or calling for an entire country or an entire place of land to be turned into a parking lot. That's the sort of savagery war unleashes. And people who end up ushering it in, who end up invading countries in an aggressive war, the way Condoleezza Rice and George Bush did, the way Joe Biden approved of and voted for and advocated, the way most of the people in our media who now run most of the most influential media outlets actively cheered for. The people who were in positions of authority and power in 2002 and 2003 in media and politics who did this should be discredited for life unless they come forward and express extreme remorse like Robert McNamara did about the Vietnam War, which most people did not think was sufficient given the magnitude of those crimes. And none of these people did that, and yet here's Condoleezza Rice being presented, interviewed by Barry Weiss, who is one of the most vocal supporters of Israel that exist anywhere on the planet outside of Israel, and maybe even inside Israel. She is, when the topic is Israel, Barry Weiss is there and firm and loyal and dedicated. No one cheerleads for Israel more than Barry Weiss. And what she decided to do this week to encourage how people should think about this war in Israel is to present Condoleezza Rice as the model that we ought to follow, not just that Israel ought to follow, but that we in the United States ought to follow, that we should learn from Condoleezza Rice. We should accept the fact that Condoleezza Rice forged the correct path after 9/11. This is what they're trying to do. And to do that, they need to rejuvenate the credibility, rehabilitate the credibility of the people who did it, including Condoleezza Rice. And that is what Barry Weiss did today in this clip that I'm going to show you. Because again, if having Benjamin Netanyahu say axis of evil and you're with us or you're with Hamas and wheeling out George Bush wasn't enough, listen to what Barry Weiss did today with Condoleezza Rice.
What lessons do you draw from the policies that America pursued in the aftermath of 9/11 that could serve as a lesson or a warning for the Israelis in this moment?
Yes, I was.
To say that question that she asked, that Barry asked, was not an unreasonable question. If anything, it's the point that we've been urging on this show, that we look to 9/11 and learn lessons from the mistakes we made when thinking about what the Israelis should do and what the United States should do in terms of its involvement. I don't actually have a problem with the question itself, but the entire show is designed to present Condoleezza Rice as the person who can teach us that, even though Condoleezza Rice was the one who made all these mistakes and continues to this very day to defend them. Listen to what Condoleezza Rice said. Do you think that remorse is coming? Do you think an admission of guilt or error is coming, that where she says, I made a lot of mistakes and the Bush administration made a lot of mistakes and those are what we should learn from? Let's listen.
Was the National Security Advisor.
This moment.
Yes, I was the National Security Advisor on that day. And I will tell you, Barry, that the next day, the only thing that we thought was don't let it happen again. I heard somebody say once, a very important American leader, they led from fear. You bet we did. While I understand those who now want to second guess what were some very tough decisions, the president said anything within our law and consistent with our values we will do to protect the country. And my gratitude that there was not another attack on our territory in the time that we were there, my gratitude that I think we dismantled the kind of Al-Qaeda that could do what they did, I'll take the criticism that we did too much.
So not only does she have no remorse to offer for anything that she did, I mean, until like 7 days ago or 9 days ago, it was canon, it was gospel that the United States and the path it chose after 9/11 was wildly misguided and destructive. That's the reason that when I would go on Fox News over the last 5 or 6 years, many of the hosts would say, you know what? I used to look at you and people like you and think you were crazy, think that you hated America, and you know what? I realize now that by supporting all these things, I was wrong. Just 2 weeks ago, Matt Taibbi went on to Greg Gutfeld's show, and Greg had prepared a musical apology for Matt and for people like Matt, which Greg Gutfeld has expressed for me before and for other people like Dave Smith, basically based on the premise that all your critiques of the United States government and the security state after 9/11 were ones I used to think were crazy, but I realized that instead they were wise. And it just took one thing to change all that: Israel. A war that involves Israel. And now suddenly we're being told that we should celebrate what the United States did after 9/11, that we should listen to Condoleezza Rice. She's not saying I regret anything I did. She's saying, quite to the contrary, I'm proud of what I did. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.